And so today what I want to do is talk about how we can view register as a pillar of learner corpus research. Because register has not always gotten as much attention in learner corpus research as it has in other fields of corpus linguistics. And as I started to prepare for today, I was thinking about this idea of register as a pillar, this metaphor of register as a pillar. It came really naturally to me, and I started to think about why. So why do I see register as a pillar of learner corpus research? So if we look at sort of the metaphorical use of the word pillar, really the definition is it's something that's regarded as reliably providing essential support for something. And this really captured very concretely how I view register and its relationship to learner corpus research. Of course, this idea that the foundational concept of register is one of the components that sort of holds up learner corpus research leads to the rather bold claim, one that I'm willing to make today, that without taking into account register, learner corpus research falters or it's weakened. And so by the same logic, when we consider register as one component of learner corpus research, I believe that line of research is strengthened. And so what I want to do today is just demonstrate the importance of considering registers, but also target register norms for language use in learner corpus analysis. And I'm going to do this by looking at sort of two different ways that register intersects with learner corpus research. One is sort of more at the research design stage, where we need to design descriptive research because we want to determine the linguistic characteristics of learner language. And so that's the first sort of at the design, the initial design stage, and show some lessons that I've learned from my own research. And then the second goal is to look at how we can use an awareness or an acknowledgement of register to strengthen our interpretations of corpus findings. So once we have our learner corpus and we have findings about the linguistic characteristics of that learner language, how can we use register to enrich or more fully interpret the linguistic descriptions that we get? So just a little bit of a preliminary. I think that throughout this series, you've heard the term register a lot, but just to sort of very briefly state how I see register. So I see register as a variety associated with a particular situation of use, and that includes a particular communicative function. And what this means is that in essence, register is a term that allows us to talk about a text variety. And we talk about a text variety because it occurs within a particular context and with a particular purpose. So the question is, why is register or text variety important? Especially if we want to study the characteristics of language learners. Well, the reason is that decades of research has shown that the registers or text varieties having differences in the situations in which they're created or the circumstances under which texts are created directly leads to linguistic variation. So we can link the linguistic characteristics of a text back to its register, its situation of use. So here's a very, very quick example. This is just a short excerpt from an authentic text, and I will guess that within seconds, all of you will have a guess as to what register this comes from. Do I have any guesses? I can't see the chat from here. But, okay. So take a minute. Guess, and I'm betting that many of you said news. And so the news would be the register category for this particular text. That news label characterizes what situation this text occurred in. And the situation is important because it leads to, we can correlate that situation with the characteristics of the language itself. So for example, Here are some of the features that you may have pulled out as being sort of markers that this might be a news text, either by themselves or in combination. And so we get things like appositive noun phrases, like this one, Dr. Michael D. Lohberg, NitroMed's chief executive. So that a positive noun phrase tells you the relevance of the person who has been mentioned. We also get things like verb complement clauses that report what someone in the story said. We have relative clauses that expand on a noun phrase and tell us the meaning or the relevance of that noun phrase. And we see lots of prepositional phrases modifying nouns, and these function to compress information. So the idea of seeking approval, that prepositional phrase of seeking approval, tells us which idea we're talking about. And so these are all linguistic features that are very, very common in news and less common in other registers. And the goal of register analysis then is to explore that link between the linguistic expressions, the linguistic features that we see within a text, and the social situation, or what we might consider the register, with a view toward explanation. So our goal is to not only document whether these features are particularly characteristic of news, but also to explain why do they happen in this register. Okay? And so we have that goal of explaining. When we talk about register analysis, we typically talk about two different components. We talk about the situational analysis, and this is sort of the non-linguistic characteristics of the text that define the text variety. So the news register, for example, is characterized non-linguistically by the fact that it's written by someone who has a lot of information for an audience, a popular audience that doesn't really need to have any existing knowledge or expertise. Generally, it's written for a pretty standard reading level, and so on. And the purpose of that news is to inform or provide information to the reader. And we pair that with the linguistic analysis. So those examples of pulling out those linguistic features that are particularly characteristic of that text sample or that register. And the key here is that we link those two things together by looking at the function. So how is it that the function of these linguistic characteristics are well aligned with the situational characteristics of the register? So we know, for example, in news that a lot of people who are relevant to the story that's being presented will be mentioned. And for example, those relative clauses and those appositive noun phrases, they serve a function to provide very succinctly the relevance of that person to the story. Okay? So this idea that we can link the linguistic features to the context of use in terms of the register, and we do that by looking here at the communicative function of those features. Now, we might wonder, what does register then have to do with learner corpora? When we talk about corpora, I think many of us would recognize that many corpora are intended to represent registers. So we have some target language domain like newspaper writing. And then we have our corpus, which is a sample of text that represent that target domain. It's not typically every text that belongs in that domain because we can't study that. And so instead we take a sample that is intended to represent that target domain. And many times what we're sampling in a corpus are the registers. In learner corpus research, many learner corpora are actually intended to represent the learners or the language that learners produce. And we do that with the goal of being able to describe the characteristics of learners, how factors like proficiency level or number of years of study or the result of a particular pedagogical application, how that might influence or change the language that they produce. And learner corpora, like most corpora, are collected using very careful collection procedures. We do a very good job in learner corpus research of collecting samples of language that represent that group of language learners that we're interested in. But because our primary focus is on the learners, we often pay less attention to, or less explicit attention to, the registers that the learners are producing. Because our goal is to learn about the characteristics of the learners and the characteristics of their language. And so we often pay less attention to what the text type is that they're producing. And so the argument that I want to make today is that we need to pay more attention to register and learner corpus research in order to both better motivate our research and to understand the results from that research. So what I'm arguing, I guess, is that we need to consider not only a learner corpus and what it represents about the learners, but also pay attention to what type of language was the learner producing. And so when we look at learner corpora, we can kind of, one of the things that's very different about learner corpora from corpora that are intended to represent registers is that we do get corpora that collect text that occurred in natural context. So this would be something like 𝗬𝗿 or 𝗵𝗂𝗃, where the learners produced language, essays or speech for their coursework. So they produce these texts in their naturally occurring lives. And we compile those texts into a corpus. And so this is what I'm calling a corpus that's produced out of natural context. But because of our need to tightly control a lot of things in order to learn something about learners, learner corpora are also very often compiled out of elicited text, meaning that the texts are produced by the learner with the intent of being included in the corpus. And this would be an example like ICLE and so on. Now, there's a middle ground of corpora where learners may produce language, for example, for assessment purposes, where that assessment has a real purpose and a real world context, so it's naturally occurring. But then we also happen to compile that assessment language into a corpus. So on the one hand, it's elicited because they're responding to some sort of assessment prompt, but in many cases, it's also naturally occurring because they needed to do this assessment for some part of their life as a language learner, and then we happen to be able to collect that into a corpus. And so you end up with this continuum of types of learner corpora. And the two examples that I'm going to use today are going to focus on this type. So I have two corpora that were collected for assessment purposes. These were for particular, the assessment purposes were within the real life context of the learners, and then that has been compiled into a corpus. Okay. So to go back, I'm going to the goals of our talk. Now that we've set up sort of the framework for what is a register and why does register matter in corpus, in learner corpora, I want to show how register can strengthen learner corpus research using two case studies. The first one is going to look at complexity in learner academic writing and really focus primarily on sort of the research design stage. So motivating the linguistic focus of the analysis. In the second case study, I'm going to look at longitudinal development in TOEFL responses. And in addition to register providing a theoretical framing, this case study will show how register can be used to enrich our interpretations and applications of findings from our learner corpora. Okay, so we will start with case study 1. The question that I'm posing here is focusing on the idea of grammatical complexity, and it asks the question, how does the use of complexity features that are most characteristic of academic writing vary across writers at different placement levels? And for me, this is a very common type of question that's asked in learner research, where we have learners who might be at different proficiency levels or placement levels, and we want to be able to explain how does their language differ across those levels. And this may be for assessment purposes, it may be to inform pedagogy, it may be to understand the process of language acquisition. We have lots of different purposes for asking these types of questions. So we'll start with this idea of a register-based approach to complexity. And this is a line of research that I've been working with for several years with 𝗪𝗏𝗪, Shelley Staples, and 𝗕𝗫 Egbert, where we take register findings related to grammatical complexity features. So the original basis for the research is grounded in this idea of register variation. The operational definition of grammatical complexity that we use is that we have the addition of structural elements to obligatory elements. So while a simple noun phrase would have just a determiner, possibly a determiner and a noun, and a simple clause has a subject and verb and maybe an object, a complex element would have these additional structural elements, like an adjective that modifies the noun, or a noun that modifies a noun, or the prepositional phrase that modifies the noun. And likely a clause, a complex clause may have more than just the subject, verb, and object. It may have other types of adverbials or embedded clauses. Now, this approach has been informed by 3 decades of empirical corpus-based register research, and I've listed some of these here. And what this research does is that identifies register-specific complexity patterns. So it says which features of complexity tend to occur in particular registers. And because it's taking this register approach, it interprets those patterns functionally. So it wants to make that connection between here are the features of complex language, and then it interprets that based on the functions of that those features and how that relates to the register or the situational features for the registers that they're common in. Another characteristic of this approach is that it recognizes the contributions of a full range of linguistic features. So you'll see in a couple of slides that there's just lots of features that we consider under this approach. Okay. So this illustrates or summarizes some of the main linguistic features that we consider in this register-based approach to complexity. And you can see that there are 2 sort of parameters along which these features vary. On the one hand, we have the structural form. So some clauses, in terms of their structure, are finite dependent clauses. Others may be non-finite dependent clauses, and others may not be clausal at all. Instead, they're phrasal. The second parameter is syntactic function. So the idea that noun phrase, whether these structures are put into noun phrases or embedded into noun phrases, or whether they're embedded into clauses. Now, the reason that these 2 parameters matter is because those decades of corpus-based register research show that there are very different patterns of, or the different types of grammatical structures occur in different registers. So for example, features that are clausal in terms of their form and function as clause constituents, so things like verb complement clauses, adjective complement clauses, and finite adverbial clauses, they show a very clear register pattern. And so you can see over here that those are much more common in conversation than they are in academic writing. In contrast, when we look at complexity features that, in terms of their structure, they're dependent phrases, and in syntactic function, they get embedded into noun phrases instead of into clauses, we see the opposite pattern. So we see that those features are much more common in academic writing than they are in conversation. And we can use these register-based patterns to make hypotheses about what we would expect to see in learner language. Okay? So when we want to apply this to the development of grammatical complexity for learners, we can make hypotheses. So if we're studying development in academic writing, and we have all of these features that were more common in conversation, then we would expect that these clausal features would begin to decrease as academic writing proficiency increases. So we assume that they develop some conversational skills first, and they develop the use of these clausal features. And as they progress in their academic writing proficiency, those clausal features will decrease. But the phrasal features that we can associate very strongly with academic writing will increase. So this is our hypothesis. This is the sort of the framing for what we would expect, we might expect to see in learner development. And this is hypothesized, right? This is the subject of a lot of ongoing research right now. So we wanted to do this. We're looking at sort of a local corpus that we have. It's called the English Placement Test, or the EPT corpus. And this is a local placement test that's administered to international students after they've been accepted to a US university. And only a subset of international students take this exam. If they have test scores on things like the TOEFL that are below a certain cutoff, or they haven't studied at an English-speaking university in the past, then they have to take this. The test is timed, and at the time of this corpus collection, the essays were all handwritten. Within the test, the learners produce two different tasks. So first they read two short passages, and then they write two essays. The first essay is a short summary that where they are supposed to summarize and then contrast the positions expressed in the two reading passages. The second essay is a longer essay, and they need to make an argument about the topic of the readings, and they can use information from the text and from their own personal lives or experiences. So the goal here is to support an argument. Now, in this case study, I'm going to just focus on essay 2, and we won't look at essay 1 in this case. Okay? And this type of argumentative task is a very, very common task in sort of elicited, both in learner corpora that are based on elicited text, but also in language assessment context. So many language assessments, placement tests, and so on require this sort of argumentative text. So after the international students produce these texts, the essays are rated. And this is a schematic of sort of the decisions that come from within this context. Now, I'm going to focus on the parts in blue, which is for graduate students, because those are the results that we're going to look at today. So graduate students, they produce their two essays, the essays are rated, and then there are 3 possible decisions. They can be placed into 101B, so this is an academic English writing course, and this will have undergraduate and graduate students. It's sort of the lowest level of additional ESL support for international students at this university. They can also be placed into 101D, which is Academic English 2 for non-native speakers. And this is a course that is specifically targeted toward graduate students and focuses on research writing. Students who pass the exam, who are rated with a pass level, they go on to their graduate programs, and they're not required to take any more writing courses unless their program happens to require it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at graduate students who are placed into this lowest level 101B, sort of the mid-level 101D, and then those who passed, who were deemed that they did not need any additional ESL writing support. So we have a local corpus of these texts, and this is just the data for those graduate students and essay 2, and so you can see the total number of test takers per level and the total number of words and so on. And you can see that this is a fairly typical learner corpus, sort of local learner corpus, where it's not really tiny, but it's also not really big. But this does represent all of the test takers in this time period. And we're going to compare across these levels. The corpus was part of speech tagged using the Biber tagger, and then we used automatic scripts and manual or interactive fixed tagging to correct individual tags that were problematic. And then we ran specialized programs to obtain rates of occurrence for a range of these features associated with complexity. We have per text counts that are normalized to 100 words. And then for each placement level, so B, D, and pass, we can take the mean and see the sort of the average frequency of use for all of those features. So here's what we get. So we go through all of that effort, all of these steps, and this is what we get. And I have to admit that when I first ran this data, I was not very excited about this graph. It doesn't really seem like there's a whole lot going on. You know, I had spent years developing this corpus. I'd been working with these grammatical complexity features for years, and I was all excited to have a study that had important results that could inform my local context, and I get this. I hope somebody's laughing out there. I can't hear anybody, but I hope that some of you are laughing. So what we get is a graph that shows not a lot of difference between the levels of these graduate students. So this shows mostly the phrasal complexity features, so things like nouns, noun plus noun sequences, nominalizations, attributive adjectives, noun plus prepositional phrases. And you can see that really there's not a whole lot going on here. They're just across the levels, the frequency of these features just doesn't change. And this is contrary to what we would have expected. We had this beautiful, well, I think it's beautiful, you know, empirically founded hypotheses of what we would expect to see as these language learners developed, and the results just don't align with what we would expect. It gets a little bit better when we look at the clausal features. So here you've got the blue is the that relative clauses. We actually see a decrease in the verb plus that verb complement clauses, and this is what we had expected because we expected those clausal features to decrease. But we see kind of a nonlinear relationship with the WH relative clauses and so on. But all of these changes are quite small. Now, when we get results like this, we're left with a couple of ways to interpret it. So one would be to say that these learners just don't show development, or that higher placement levels for this particular local placement test does not mean that they produce more grammatically complex language. And that's not a very satisfying observation or conclusion to reach. And I was a bit surprised by these findings, so I started to think about, well, why? Why did we get these findings? So I want to take us back to the prompt. So recall that we are looking at this essay 2, which was the argumentative essay. And they can use information from the text and their student experiences. And we based our initial research design, choosing the linguistic features to study, by looking at the target register, formal academic writing, and say, what features would we expect to see? And then we look for those features in our learner text. But if we compare the register of the text included in our EPT corpus and our target register, academic writing, or particularly expert academic writing, we actually don't see a lot of alignment between the situational characteristics. So for example, in our learner corpus, really the primary purpose of that text was to convey their own personal opinion. Whereas in expert academic writing, which is primarily what this framework is based on, there's really no conveying of personal opinion, or very little. In contrast, it's primarily informational. Whereas the EPT essay in our learner corpus, you do have to convey some information by summarizing the text, but really it's more about your own experiences and so on. And we see that here in the evidence. So in the learner corpus, we're summarizing from text, we're giving our personal experiences, And this largely doesn't happen in the expert academic writing, the thing that we use to inform the selection of linguistic variables. We have other differences. For example, in the EPT, our learner corpus, they're writing for a general audience. There's no specialized audience. This is seen as sort of a test of general writing ability. Whereas expert academic writing has a very specialized audience. We assume that they have a lot of prior information. We also have sort of circumstantial differences. So in our learner corpus, these were handwritten essays, whereas expert academic writing, at least in these days, is primarily produced using computers and technology. It's produced over a long period of time, and it's extensively edited. And these are things that our learners didn't have, right? They had to handwrite. They had a very specific time constraint. They had 40 minutes in which they needed to read and then write 2 essays, and that left very little time for any editing. So in essence, when we compare the registers between the learner corpus and the target register that we use to form or to select our linguistic variables, we don't see a lot of alignment. And so not considering the register of what our learner corpus actually represents may lead us to design research or end up with findings that are not very interpretable, but that may actually be misleading. Okay, and that's what I want to show with this next example. So remember that I said one of the ways that we can interpret these findings is to say, well, these language learners don't vary across placement levels. So across placements, the language is the same in terms of complexity. And this isn't very good news for a test usually, because complexity is seen as that marker of development. But then we say, well, but the test wasn't eliciting the same type of language that we were intending to capture. But what happens if we take that same population of language learners and we compare that argumentative task that they did to an informational task? And what do we get? So we actually have, as part of an older version of this same corpus, where the graduate students admitted to the same institution, placed into the same placement levels, but in prior semesters, were given a very different type of task. They were given what we call an integrated or informational prompt. They were provided with a chart that had some basic data, and then they had to write an essay that summarized the data and interpret or suggest reasons for those trends. Okay, so this was a very different task. We don't have very much data for this, but what this analysis is going to show is how the nature of the language in our learner corpus has to align with our research design. Okay? So if we compare now the task in this other version of the corpus where they wrote an informational essay, we see a lot more alignment between our target register and our the texts that are in our learner corpus. So now they're not giving their personal opinions, but rather they're conveying information that they have summarized from the chart that they were provided. We still have some differences, so there's still no specialized audience. We don't expect the learner to have any specialized knowledge. They're just getting the information from the graph. Okay? But in terms of the situational characteristics, of this informational essay are much more aligned with the academic, expert academic writing. And when we look at results, we see not huge differences, but we see more of the types of findings that we would expect to see. So these graphs just look at the graduate students who passed the exam, and it compares that first set of learners who wrote the argumentative task and the second set of learners that wrote the informational task. And you can see that for these phrasal level features, so here's just the overall number of nouns. Here we've got all those other phrasal features, attributive adjectives, noun plus noun, noun plus of, and so on. And what you see is that we do see this increased use of those phrasal features in this context. Okay, if we look at what these mean in terms of illustrating these terms, so this is on the left is the argumentative task, and on the right is the informational task. Okay, and we can see that they listed very different language. So for example, on the left, we see lots of personal opinion and references to the reading passage that corresponds to the nature of that task. Whereas in the level pass for the informational task, we don't see those personal pronouns and private verbs like think. Instead, we get references to the data. This table shows the percentage of something else. Okay? We see an increased use of these noun plus noun structures, where one noun modifies another. And this we can associate directly with that informational purpose. We see something similar with the adjective plus nouns, and so on. So basically what I would argue that this case study shows is that by carrying out a register analysis of our learner corpus, meaning carrying out that situational analysis plus linguistic analysis, and then trying to link between the linguistic characteristics and the situational by looking at those functions, we can better align methodological decisions like variable selection with the register that our learner corpus actually represents to get more meaningful and interpretable results. So if our learner corpus, the context that our learners exist in is producing this placement test, and we want to be able to learn something about those writers at different placement levels, we have to align our linguistic features with something that makes sense for that register. We can't base it on theory alone. Okay? This can also help to provide guidance for the design of corpora to describe academic writing development, explain unexpected results, and understand why we get variation, or a lack of variation in some cases, across the subcorpora that we're trying to compare. Okay, quickly turning to case study number 2, looking at the longitudinal development of TOEFL IBT responses. And this is a funded project that I did with a couple of PhD students, 𝗟𝗪𝗀𝗂 and 𝗵𝗠, and I'll talk about this one just briefly. So if we recall, the purpose of this case study is to look at how register can inform the interpretation of results. The question that we're asking in this case study is, how does the linguistic production of language learners develop over time, mediated by mode and task type? And then a supplementary question that we were asking in this particular study was, to what extent do these findings provide support for a validity argument for the TOEFL IBT? So this is another example of a corpus that's formed out of language assessment data, where these language learners were taking the TOEFL exam for a real purpose, and then that has been collected into this corpus. I won't go into this slide very much, but I put it in here for posterity's sake. And this is the idea of how we're looking at validation. So we're using Chappell et al.'s 2008 interpretive argument for the interpretation and use of assessment scores. And where we're going to pay attention is primarily here, because the corpus, the analysis of the learner corpus, is going to provide the backing that allows us to make an assumption that ultimately leads to a conclusion about the validity of the test. So just to make it a little bit more precise, if we want to make a claim that in the explanation inference within this framework, what we need to be able to show is that linguistic knowledge, as evidenced in learner language production, varies in expected ways. So our assumption is, if this test works well to capture language proficiency, is that learners will vary their language, and they'll do so in expected ways. And in this particular study, because we're looking at longitudinal data, we're particularly expecting that linguistic performance will vary relative to time and experience learning English. Okay? So over time, we would expect that learners' language becomes more similar to higher proficiency learners as their proficiency also increases. Okay? So here, what we're doing is we're using learner corpora to provide evidence of language variation between learners and making sure that that variation is happening in the ways that are expected. In terms of this data set was collected by Ling, Powers, and Adler 2014 and consisted of native Chinese speakers enrolled in a general English course in a Chinese high school and some who were involved in a TOEFL IBT prep course. They took the TOEFL IBT practice test 2 times, the pre and the post test, and they did that 9 months apart, and we have about 90 test takers. They produced both the spoken and the written portions of the TOEFL IBT. For the spoken items, we combine these, do this short length, and so we have, for each test taker, we have 1 observation for the independent spoken tasks and 1 observation for the integrated spoken text. In terms of corpus preparation, we had to exclude anyone with fewer than 100 words of production. And so we end up with a relatively small corpus, 42 observations for or speakers for the spoken corpus and 39 writers for the written corpus. Okay. This graph shows simply their change in TOEFL scores over time for the 2 modes, speaking and writing, and the 2 task types, independent and integrated. And so what this shows is that from the pre-test to the post-test, their scores did increase. It also shows that this is, these are fairly low-level learners. You can see the TOEFL scores here going up to about 2.5. So we've verified that the learners took the test at 2 different times and that their scores increased. Okay, so now we're going to look at the linguistic characteristics of that language using multidimensional analysis. I'll provide just a really brief introduction because I know that MD analysis has been talked about in many of the talks in this LAEL series, but it was developed as a means for identifying systematic patterns of variation across registers by looking at statistical co-occurrence patterns of multiple linguistic features using factor analysis. We interpret those patterns as dimensions of variation by looking at the features that co-occur and what kinds of communicative functions do those co-occurring features share. This enables us to describe a discourse domain or an observation both quantitatively, so the extent to which it uses these features that the MD analysis identifies, and functionally. So how are they using these features to carry out communicative functions? Now, for this, we are using an existing multidimensional analysis. So we saw that the corpus in this longitudinal study is quite small. And so it wouldn't be appropriate to carry out a new MD analysis. So instead, we use an established dimensions from Bethany and Gray 2013. This was a multidimensional analysis carried out specifically on TOEFL IBT responses, but it was a much larger corpus with a broader range of scores and all of our mode and task type levels. So this is sort of the main model that we'll be using. And this revealed 4 dimensions of variation, and we're going to look at just a couple of them here. But so let's take a pause and think about, well, what's the role of this prior MD analysis? The goal here is this prior MD analysis, based on a much larger data set and a broader range of variation, provides us with the target register norms. So if we would expect language learners over time to increase in proficiency, and we would expect linguistic variation across proficiency levels, we hope to be able to predict how their language will change over time. And so we're trying to figure out that question: did these language learners, did their language develop in the ways that we would have expected? Okay. So we're going to look just at dimension 1. This is the linguistic composition of dimension 1, which is interpreted as literate versus oral responses. So in D analysis, we get 2 sets of features. And the idea is that these features are in complementary distribution. So these features with positive loadings, this means that these features tended to co-occur in a text. So if a text had a high frequency of common nouns, they also tended to have a high frequency of concrete nouns, a high frequency of pre-modifying nouns, of attributive adjectives, and the remainder of these features. In contrast, texts that tended to have a lot of present tense verbs, mental verbs, modal verbs, third person pronouns, and so on, these features tended to co-occur. And a text that had a high frequency of these features tended to have a lower frequency of the positive features. So they're in this complementary distribution. Now, when we look at these positive features, these were interpreted as literate text. This is an example of a high-scoring integrated written response, and you can see a lot of these nouns, different types of nouns, prepositional phrases, attributive adjectives that we associate with written responses and with informational responses. And you can see how these features all tend to occur with a high frequency. In contrast, if we look at a text that does not use a lot of those features, and instead it uses a lot of the features with the negative loadings. So we see lots of present tense verbs, these modals, third person pronouns, and so on. So we don't see a lot of those noun, adjective, and preposition features. Instead, we see these negative features. Now, what we can do with these results is plot our register categories, or in this case, our mode and task type variables along the dimension. So texts that have a high positive score, it means that they use a lot of those positive features, those nouns, adjectives, prepositions, and so on. And a text that used a lot of the negative features would have a low negative score. So these scores basically quantify the extent to which the features are used within these groups of texts. And so here we go. We can functionally interpret this based on those features and looking at the text excerpts and then also the register distributions. So for example, if we look up here, we see written integrated score 4, written integrated score 3, and then you get the lower scoring written integrated. And so we look at the distribution of these across and help come up with that interpretation of literate versus oral. Okay. And then we do the same for the negative features. Now, how do we apply this to longitudinal language development? So this is our longitudinal corpus plotted on this dimension. And if we just look at the longitudinal corpus and how their language changed over time, we can see that it did change over time, but we really don't have a way to interpret this. And so what we have to do is compare that to the reference corpus that has this larger set or larger learner corpus that establishes our register expectations or our target register norms. And so very quickly what we'll see is that, so the purple here is the written independent task, and you can see that they started out sort of off the charts. They weren't very similar to our register norms for written independent tasks, but by the time they took the test the second time, you can see that their score is very much in line with our target norms or what we would expect. Okay. And we can see this in the language as well. So this is 2 written independent responses written by the same language learner at time 1 versus time 2. And you can see that originally they had a very negative score, meaning that it was very oral. So you see the modals, you see present tense, you see third person pronouns, and when you read it, it sounds very oral. Versus at time 2, you can see a lower negative score, meaning they moved more towards those positive features. And we can see that with fewer of sort of personal framing of this information. Okay. And we can do the same thing with speaking. I'm not going to go over these results a whole lot, but they are here in the slides if anyone's interested. But it shows a similar result where here are our target register norms for speaking. And what we can see is that, again, for both speaking task types, they started sort of off the charts and not really being within our target norms, but over time they approached those norms that we would expect to see. Okay, so in summary, most of the changes observed in this longitudinal corpus moved toward register-specific norms and became more similar to the observed patterns that established what we would expect to see. The learners exhibited increased mode and task type differentiation. So while they started out with their language being closer together in particular modes, over time they were able to differentiate speech versus written tasks, and integrated versus independent tasks, and they were able to differentiate their language. And this leads us to be able to make an interpretation that learners change their language in the expected ways. I'm going to wrap up. I know that I'm running out of time here, so I'll just wrap up with a few comments. What I hope to have shown today is that register analysis provides meaningful insights to learner corpus research. So it can provide us with a basis for hypothesizing, empirically analyzing language development, but it can also help us to interpret our results and help to know what it is that we're looking for. Going back to sort of my title, I wanted to illustrate that register comes in at both the design and the interpretation stage. And ensuring at the design stage, we can ensure alignment between our linguistic measures that we use to characterize learner language and what we expect based on what the learner corpus represents. And we can see that if we don't have good alignment between our measures and what the learner corpus really represents, then we don't get very meaningful results. And at the same time, we often need register in order to understand or interpret the findings that we get. I want to end by recommending one final thing, which is that arguing for an increased attention to register in learner corpus design. So not just dealing with the learner corpus that we have, but actually in designing it. So if we remember, we have this continuum of learner corpora. What I would like to argue is that in elicited learner corpora, we pay more attention to the register that's being elicited. Broaden the range of registers elicited, so beyond just argumentative text, and then also to increase the authenticity of those elicited registers, making sure that what we elicit reflects the real life context of learners. And then on the other side of the continuum with natural context, we need more learner corpora compiled from natural context. This is often very hard to do, and so we need ways to overcome those limitations of building corpora from natural context. Okay, and I will stop there.